Hi, everyone. Welcome to EERC's special webinar book talk. Today it's titled Major Trade-Offs, and we're going to be in conversation with Corey Moss-Pech and Dan Douglas. My name is Michelle Vanoy. I am Director of the Education and Employment Research Center here at Rutgers, and really excited today to be joined on this webinar with two key collaborators and longtime colleagues at EERC, Dan Douglas and Corey Moss-Pech, and really excited about the conversation around Corey's recent book that was released called Major Trade-Offs: The Surprising Truths About College Majors and Entry-Level Jobs. Really interesting book that explores the relationship between what students learn in college and the skills needed on their first jobs. And so Dan is, just as a brief intro, is assistant professor of sociology at Montclair State University and a longtime collaborator with EERC. And Corey Moss-Pech is assistant professor of sociology at Florida State University and also collaborator with EERC. And so we're really excited to have this very sociological discussion, but a discussion that's very near and dear to the core of the work that EERC does, kind of looking at that connection between education to work and the pipelines that lead us there. So just as far as today's structure, Dan's going to start off with some commentary and reflections on the book, and then he'll be conducting a Q&A with our author here to discuss the themes of the book. After about 30 minutes or so, we're going to open up the discussion to audience Q&A. At that point, we encourage anybody in the audience to share your questions. Either raise your hand to pose a question or post questions in the chat. And you can also post those throughout if questions come up, and I'll be taking a look at questions that come in. So with that, I'm just going to hand things over to Dan and look forward to the discussion today. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm really excited to give this talk or to have this conversation with Corey. And it's a great book. I've read it. Everyone should read it. Everyone should buy it. But I'll give my quick blurb on the book, and then I'll start throwing questions at Corey. He said he wanted unplanned, so we're going to go with that. So here we go. One question for aspiring college students and their families is, what major should they choose? And one aspect of that question is whether a given college major will lead the student into a good job prepared with the skills to succeed in it. Corey Moss-Pech's new book, Major Trade-Offs: The Surprising Truth About College Majors and Entry-Level Jobs, asks a critical question. What is the relationship between the contents of college education and the contents of majors and the requirements of first jobs? It specifically makes a distinction, the book makes a distinction between majors that the author calls, in what the author calls practical arts and the liberal arts. We can think of practical arts, the examples the cases that Corey offers are business and engineering, and liberal arts are English and communications, where practical arts or liberal arts degrees are regarded as majors of passion with maybe less connection to the labor force, while practical arts majors are considered career-focused and tightly coupled to the requirements of work. Major Trade-Offs is based on interviews with 91 undergraduates at a non-elite public university in the Midwest. All 91 students in the sample participated in internships, which indicated their career focus. All had declared majors in either those two practical arts fields or in the two liberal arts fields, and were interviewed during their senior year in 2015-16. And Corey, you can correct me on anything that I miss about your book. And the second wave interviews were conducted a year later with recent graduates who were by then in their entry-level jobs. I think one remarkable thing is that of the 91 students, 85 were followed up with. So there's a lot of validity between the first wave and second wave. It's not a huge drop-off that we frequently find with interview research. Some of the findings in the book would be unsurprising to those familiar with the sociology of higher education and specifically the college-to-work transition. For example, despite different training in college, about half of students across majors did clerical and non-substantive tasks in their internships, even as the internships of practical arts majors were far more likely to lead to entry-level employments. Many of these students did kind of the familiar internship kind of tasks of spreadsheets and PowerPoints and things like that. But the internships for the practical arts majors were more likely to lead to jobs. Moss-Pech calls these career conveyor belt internships. By contrast, liberal arts majors often found their own dead-end internships with firms that lacked the resources to hire additional staff. This segregation of internships often shaped the college to work transition for students, with liberal arts majors often facing longer and more difficult post-college job searches. Um, Other findings, however, are more surprising in Corey's book, specifically those related to how graduates describe their entry-level jobs. Only 30% of those practical arts graduates in business and engineering did primarily substantive tasks, those kinds of things that are related to what they studied. And this is to be compared with 58% of liberal arts graduates. So liberal arts graduates were more likely to do practical kind of like things related to their major when they got into their entry level work. Just some examples. Jackie, an engineering graduate, was her entry level job had her querying engineers about the cost of car parts. Not very engineering. While Valerie, a business graduate, compiled key performance indicators, KPIs, into an Excel spreadsheet. These sound a lot like very general tasks, not specifically related to business or engineering. Notably, both of these young women had strong job title to degree title matches, which is to say that their jobs sound like their degrees. And that's often a way that sociologists measure how related to your degree your job is, just by the title. And those jobs were also much more likely to be, those jobs were also high paying, right? Um, Liberal arts majors, again, by contrast, made frequent and direct use of the skills that they acquired in college. Two examples. Sophie was a communications major, and she designed social media strategy for clients at an advertising firm. Jennifer was an English major, and she wrote social media posts for restaurants at a digital marketing company. So again, a communications person doing a communications strategy, an English major doing writing, right? Really job focused. But despite this higher correspondence between their majors and their entry-level work, liberal arts majors were often in far lower paying and far less secure roles. And this is at the heart of the trade-off, which is, we might think of the trade-off in one way that the career-focused majors get the good careers, right? While the liberal arts majors, get the passion majors. But when we look at this a different way, as Corey does, in terms of job skills, it's the liberal arts majors who seem to be using more of their skills at work, while the business and engineering, the practical arts majors, are using less of their skills at work. Given this, how do the graduates themselves see the value of their degrees? Most of the practical arts majors seem to feel like their degrees were necessary to secure their jobs, but they didn't feel like college provided them the specific skills or the human capital necessary to do their jobs well. Many expressed that the non-technical soft skills that everyone learns in college were more likely to be part of their day-to-day work. Liberal arts majors, and maybe this is because of the kind of public perception of these as not job relevant, gave more human capital defenses of the value of their degree, saying that their degree prepared them to do the jobs that they were doing. They were more likely to say that. But again, even liberal arts majors also felt that the more general kind of soft skills like teamwork and critical thinking were very useful in their entry level jobs. So, thinking about the contribution of the book, Major Trade-Offs makes an important contribution to sociological theories of education and its relationship to work. It provides an important corrective to human capital theory, which argues that certain degrees should be expected to command higher salaries because they provide more valuable skills. But Corey's research and his interviews with students cast doubt on this relationship, that at least in the entry-level positions where students were in the second wave interviews. Graduates in practical arts appeared less likely than liberal arts students to use their learned skills in their majors in their day-to-day work tasks, even as the jobs held by practical arts majors were both more stable and higher paying and more likely had that degree to job title correspondence. And the second contribution that I took away from this was that we see internships as playing this important sorting role, another sorting thing in higher education, and that identification of the internship as a sorting mechanism may imply some policy solutions. To the degree that practical arts programs at non-elite public institutions, like the one Corey studied, control access to internships and career services, meaning that the business and engineering internships are only for business and engineering students, those programs may be inflating the value of the credential they provide. Um, Major Trade-Offs reveals that liberal arts students are at least as capable, if not more so, of being successful in the same sorts of internships and entry-level jobs as their practical arts peers. We might think about what colleges and universities might do with that information. This book is an important read for at least these two reasons, and hopefully many more, which we can talk about today. And I'm pleased to talk to Corey about this today. Thanks. So, Corey, I mean, I'll open it up and say, what do you think? What's your first takeaway on my thoughts here?
Well, I really appreciate it. First, thank you, Dan, for engaging so thoughtfully with my book. And also thank you to the EERC at Rutgers and Michelle and Melissa who helped put this together. I really appreciate it. Um, so yeah, I think obviously the overview you gave my book is correct in terms of what the book is about. And I do think, for me, to build off a little bit what you said,
Yeah.
part of my sort of thinking about this book is I want to kind of sort of challenge the basic dichotomy that we see, right, between majors that are practical and majors that are more sort of passion based, right? Like we have this dichotomy between majors that are useful and majors that are maybe less useful. And I think that that's wrong. I think at schools like the one I studied, all majors provide a mix of occupationally specific competencies and more general liberal arts competencies, but only some of those skills or some of those majors are actually valued by employers in the labor market, right? So a
Mm,
point that I try to make when I talk about the book is that the practical arts degrees are really useful credentials for entering the labor market in a kind of good middle class job by traditional employment indicators, but not necessarily because the underlying skills that they provide. But a lot of our public discourse about why those majors are useful assumes that those students are using their skills, and that's just not what I found, right?
yeah.
Whereas the other hand, right, like I don't think it's all doom and gloom for the liberal arts, because I find that a lot of those students, as you point out, right, use their skills in real ways and they find satisfaction in that. And so, those are really useful degrees for the skills that they provide, even if they are less um, in-demand credentials in the labor market, right? So I don't want readers, listeners, viewers of this, Zoom to think that I think that like all practical arts majors are bad, all liberal arts majors are good, right? The takeaway is more that the majors are not as distinct as we think of them, and there are
Mm,
these nuanced trade-offs that students are making, although obviously they're not making them in a sort of conscious way.
yeah.
And part of my goals for the book is to make those trade-offs less opaque, right? To give students a better understanding of what the range of outcomes are, and then give them the tools to sort of prioritize which direction is more preferable for their own situation.
Excellent. Awesome. Great. And so I want to ask you just a few hip shot kind of questions. Think the first one is, so you talk about the tasks that students do in their internships and their entry level jobs, and you describe them as either substantive or clerical. And I think that's one of the key terms or key points of contention in the book. And so I was wondering if you could talk about how you made that distinction and why it matters, and specifically given the popular imagination about how passion, liberal arts versus practical kind of job-focused majors connect to subsequent employment. So yeah, about that distinction, clerical and substantive.
Yeah, so it's a good question. So in the book, I find that about 70% of business and engineering majors do exclusively clerical tasks in their entry level jobs. And I use both lay and technical definitions of clerical work, whether their jobs are routine, repetitive, non-discretionary administrative tasks, these kinds of things.
Mm,
And it actually wasn't a difficult interpretive endeavor.
mm,
It was very clear when students were just doing data entry, right? For a lot of them, it was data entry. It was, I take these numbers, I put them into a computer, and that's like my whole job, which is really eye-opening to me, right? Because in the public imagination, engineering degrees pay off because graduates are designing algorithms or building robots. And I just didn't find very much of that in my sample. So it was a very conservative measure. Anything that was not clerical, I coded as substantive, right? Often this meant using skills that students learned in their degree, right? Because it was their entry level job. That's sort of what they had to draw on when doing their job. So you gave the example of students who are sort of writing English and communications majors who are writing.
yeah.
And I found about half of them did substantive work. And part of this is intuitive, right? Like a lot of the business and engineering majors go to work for large bureaucratic organizations with a relatively high division of labor. So we would expect them to be doing more narrow tasks. We wouldn't necessarily expecting them to do tasks that aren't like very skilled, but their tasks are more narrow, right? Whereas many of the liberal arts majors go to work for these smaller organizations and, they can't afford to hire a lot of people, so everybody does everything. And it creates a much more positive work experience for these graduates, even if they, have other issues that arise from it, whether it be, low pay, limited opportunities to advance, these kinds of things. And, it's not within the scope of this book, but, I followed these students even longer, and several of the English and communications majors who really liked their jobs eventually had to leave them because there were no opportunities for growth, whether that be in their job title, their wages, things like this. So I think, right, as the title suggests, I really think of these things in terms of trade-offs, right? Like you could work for a big, stable organization, mostly do clerical work, but make a pretty decent middle-class salary. Or you can go work for a, smaller organization that might give you more interesting things to do, but won't quite pay you as well. And of course, this doesn't apply to everyone, right?
Right.
There are exceptional cases, but this was the kind of general pattern that I found.
Yeah. So I'll throw another one at you. Uh, the book describes internships uh, as being either dead end or what you called career conveyor belt, right? And
Mhm.
as with any kind of Weberian ideal type, both of these conjure up strong mental images, right? One of, the dead end internship feels like, oh my God, this is, soul crushing and will not lead to anything. And the career conveyor belt is like you're hiring me, but just softly before it actually happens. But I wonder if there's any space, if you identified space between these two categories. I'm almost certain you did, but I'm interested to hear about it. Um, and then related to that, because we're on internships, many researchers talk about a distinction between like the value of paid versus unpaid internships. And I wonder how this does or does not overlap with your categories of dead end and career conveyor belt.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'll start with the latter one, right? Like, when I started working on this project, when I was a graduate student in about 2015,
Mm,
or I guess even earlier, right? If you're thinking about conceiving the project and trying to understand what I'm actually going to be doing.
yeah,
Um, the actual question that motivated me most was about internships because in the time between when I was in college, in the sort of mid to late, 2000s, and between when I was starting on this paper, a little less, or this project, right, a little less than 10 years later, internships have become really ubiquitous, right? Before that, they were mostly confined to government, the arts, these kinds of things. But then they sort of spread to all kinds of organizations, right? And at the time that I started the project, there was actually very surprisingly little to me research on internships, except for this paid unpaid distinction, right? So there was quite a bit of research on how paid internships led to better outcomes and were better for graduates. And there's a little bit of sort of ethnographic research on, well, interns doing these things that we think of interns doing, like you said, getting coffee, making copies, whatever. But there's actually very little research about how internships themselves varied in any substantive way besides this paid, unpaid distinction. And so that was a sort of primary focus when I began conceiving of the project and began the data collection. And it is, of course, true that the dead end internships tended to be less likely to be paid. Partially, this is again a function of the organizations that offer these internships, right? So if you get an internship at a small organization, they're less likely to pay you. Um, but the other part of this that I think is interesting is, a lot of the students who found dead end internships tried to find them through their professional networks. And because they were students not from particularly high socioeconomic backgrounds and not at anything like an advanced career stage, those networks weren't particularly fruitful, right? And so if they reached out to an organization and said, "Hey, will you take me as an intern?" The organization was usually like, "Yeah, sure, why not? The free labor, let's do it." But they don't necessarily have a program in place to ensure it's a good experience or could lead to a beneficial long-term outcome, right?
yeah,
Whereas the career conveyor belt internships at these organizations have these formal policies and procedures for recruiting interns, having a set number of them being full-time employees after the internship. They got paid a relatively decent, wage. I was interviewing engineering undergraduates who made more in a summer than I made in the whole year as a graduate student, right? So like these processes were happening. Um, and not all dead-end internships are bad internships, right? They give students professional experience and then put on their resume. There's all other reasons we can consider them to be, not bad. But they were less likely to be paid. And particularly the students who had sort of your traditional grunt internship work, were also more likely to be unpaid. And I think it's because the organizations didn't have to value them, right? Like if you pay someone to be there, you're going to try to get something out of them, right? But if you just let an intern come and hang out and you don't pay them, you might not give them anything interesting to do.
Mm.
So that was really relevant, I think, for the distinction as well. As for what's between the two, right? So there were organizations that tried to mimic the career conveyor belt process, even if they weren't large bureaucratic national firms, by hiring interns on an ad hoc basis or giving an intern like contract work to do. Particularly with the communications and English majors, there were examples of small companies who hired them as interns being like, hey, we'll pay you a couple of $100 to work on a project, during the semester when the internship is over or when you graduate. So in that way, there was some blurring.
Mm.
Um, but I would say that's the sort of primary way, right? Is that if we think about the career conveyor belt internships as being these structured internships that recruit on campus, that move students from interns to entry-level jobs, um, the dead-end internships really didn't replicate any part of that process except for occasionally offering students paid work. Well, I shouldn't say occasionally. I think about half of them were paid.
Yeah.
And by giving students sometimes the opportunity to continue working as like part-time or contract workers, even after the unpaid portion of the internship might be over.
Got it. Right. Yeah. So there is some gray space, but there is a lot of overlap, a lot of kind of like corner cases or on diagonal relationship between paid, unpaid, dead end. Yeah. I guess I'm going to fold two questions together. So the book suggests that the biggest value that many or most graduates see in their earned degrees is in the general or soft skills that come either from the liberal arts side of the college curriculum or from the general kind of structure of college life and college coursework in general. And I think that folds into I think something everyone would ask about any data collected before 2020 or before 2022 is the AI question, right?
Mhm.
Which is like what give that, you know, what might we think of as like the value of discrete skills, things like writing and things like, computer programming that versus things like soft skills in the in this kind of this world where AI is kind of maybe automating some of those substantive tasks, but maybe isn't able to automate soft skills. So I'm just wondering, and again, I've seen you at book talks before, and people ask the AI question. So I wonder if you have further thought on this.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I want to say is that a lot of the technical tasks that graduates in practical arts disciplines were sort of overseeing are ones that had likely already been automated, right?
Mm,
And so, I can't speak to change over time. I just interviewed these students at one point. But there's a student I like to give as an example, a graduate who in the book I call Samantha. She works for a large fashion retailer, and she's in charge of like women's tops and figuring out how many women's tops to send to all the different stores, right? So maybe it's like 30 to the Des Moines, Iowa strip mall, but 400 to the New York Fifth Avenue flagship, right? Kind of thing.
right.
And what she does in that job is she basically just puts inputs into a proprietary Oracle software system that uses some kind of algorithm to tell her how many shirts to send to each place, right?
Right.
So, right, the sales report comes in, we sold X number of shirts last week. She enters some data from that sales report into the Oracle system. The Oracle system tells her how many shirts to send this week, right? I suspect at some point that job required math, but it no longer does, right? So I think tasks like that had already been largely taken over by computer software, even if we don't call it AI, right? Prior to 2020, 2022, whenever.
Yeah.
So, like, I think some of that was already going on, right? And when I first wrote the book and the AI stuff was really sort of coming to fore, my initial inclination was that it would actually not impact the processes that I would already have been seeing, right? So engineers can AI can design a bridge much more easily than it can write an Instagram caption. But as a
Mm,
society, we don't really value the skills that go into writing an Instagram caption. So we'll replace all the English majors with a crappy AI software, and we'll just have bad Instagram captions. But
yeah.
we'll still hire engineers to like oversee the AI for building the bridges, right? Which, like, of
Got it.
course, we need people overseeing the AI to build the bridges, right? I'm not saying that they shouldn't do that. But I
Right.
think that we see these cultural value of skills mapping onto like not what AI can do best, but who we feel is most replaceable with AI
Right.
kind of thing.
Right.
And then I entered into a more pessimistic period where I thought, well, maybe AI is just going to kind of destroy everyone's jobs, and it would be this really tough situation where, much to your question about the soft skills, right? We would have AI slop for entry-level jobs, AI slop for internships, AI slop for maybe intermediate career jobs, but then somehow we're supposed to try to find mid-career professionals with skills, right, to like lead our economy forward, even though every job from like your high school years to that mid-career point is just AI slop, right?
Right.
And so that was like a concern that I had, and to some extent I still have. But now I kind of think the AI bubble is going to burst and that organizations' reliance on it is going to be scaled back a bit. Right? We see some evidence that organizations are not spending as much money on AI as they were even 6 months ago.
Right.
Some evidence of large scale, big organizations putting a lot of money into AI and not seeing the return that they want.
Yeah.
We see examples of, and there's an intellectual property part of this too, right? Like if Warner Brothers makes a movie that's 100% AI, they can't copyright it. They can't make money off it. They can't license it. They can't sell it because nobody owns the copyright, right? If a big accounting firm only uses AI to do audits and a lot of those go haywire, there's like no accountability and that's a problem, right? And I think organizations are starting to realize this a little bit.
Yeah.
And then the last thing I'll say about this, I want to give you an example. I gave a talk last week at a college, and somebody told me that her husband works as a manager of a call center, and they had integrated AI chatbots to answer all of the kind of low-level questions that people had. But if people had a hard question or they had a difficult case, right, it was escalated to a call center employee. But call center employees can't actually spend their day for 8 hours dealing with difficult cases. So what they've had to do, because the call center employees no longer have routine cases, build in like 15 minutes of like recharge time an hour. So like the call center employee will deal with difficult cases and difficult customers for like 45 minutes. And then they get like a little bit of a 15-minute break because it's just, you can't do that for 8 hours. So the AI integration hasn't actually saved this organization money or made it more efficient, right? Is what they ended up finding. So I think these kinds of things are going to become more salient in the economy. And I think, I don't know, I think my current thinking, which is maybe overly optimistic, is that the bubble will burst. There'll be a little bit of a pullback from it. And ultimately it will, for reasons that are both good and bad, be cheaper for organizations to hire entry-level workers to do a lot of work that needs to be done rather than relying on AI, especially because the tasks that the AI is best at are technical tasks that are really highly culturally valued. So I guess this brings me back to my first, full circle to my initial thought, which is we're not going to replace engineers with AI. And I think we're starting to realize that actually it's not that easy to replace English majors with AI and not that cost effective because English majors are cheap. And so maybe it will become less prominent.
That's fair. Yeah. And we might get some more questions in the Q&A about that. I'm going to go with my last question, which you've heard before, but that's only because I'm always interested in it. You know, if we're back to the internship question, which was the motivating interest of your book, if internships play this central role in your causal sequence, right? Practical arts get better internships, which leads to smoother labor market transitions, right? And if we know that especially at non-elite institutions, I think it's different at elite institutions where everyone gets access to the job fairs and the career services because it's like elite networks, right? But at non-elite institutions, the majors jealously guard their career services and their job fairs, right, to make sure that their majors do well. But your research seems to suggest, in fact, very directly suggests that liberal arts majors could be just as successful in the same internships and the same entry-level jobs. With that information, what can colleges or should colleges do?
Yeah, so, thanks for that question. Like, I think one of the things that I advocate for in the book, right, in the conclusion, I talk about things that maybe schools can do, employers can do, people can do, right?
Yeah.
One of the things I advocate for in the book is for universities ensuring that when they bring employers to campus, that they have to interact with students from every major, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I know universities might bristle at this, but the kind of university that my book is about, right? A large public university that tries to serve all people and, all constituencies. These universities tend to have a fair amount of local and regional political and economic power, right? Yeah. So if you're a big university and you say to a company like, hey, you can go to our engineering career fair, but you also have to go to our arts and sciences career fair, I think a lot of companies will do that, right? Now, they might still send an engineer who doesn't know anything about the various other parts of their organization, like human resources or communications or whatever, the arts and sciences career fair, and they might tell the students like, I don't know, I can't help you. But there are lots of opportunities, I think, for both organizations and students um, to find enrichment in being open to these opportunities. And I think a lot of people would enjoy these opportunities. I think students could be successful in these opportunities. And so one of the things I really advocate for is a better integrated career services across universities rather than have them be siloed by college. I think that's really important. I think universities should use their political and economic capital to sort of insist on these opportunities for their students. And I think that students in these majors should know that, there are lots of local firms that make connections with your university or regional firms or national firms, as the case may be. And even if you are an English major, they might be willing to hire you for a paid internship and a job if you express interest in that, right? I think a lot of these companies think the English majors aren't interested. And I think a
Right.
lot of the English majors think these companies don't want an English major. But I think if the company knew the English major was interested and the English major knew that the company had lots of functions they could hire them for, I think both sides of the equation would be happy with that outcome. I just think there's a disconnect there. And I think a lot of the issues in general that I see with the disconnect between what I see as the employable skills students learn and the opportunities that students want and the labor market opportunities available to them, I really see often as a problem of translation, right? Like businesses know they need people with good quote unquote soft skills. Um, and English majors have those skills, but English majors don't know how to speak the languages that businesses hear, right?
Mhm.
And I don't know how to speak that language, right? I'm a
Me neither.
sociologist, right? I've, never had a real job, but um, but there are people who know how to do that, right? And so I think
Right.
another thing that career services offices could do is more of this kind of skills translation, more of this sort of skills mapping, right? There's a term that some people advocate for, like a shadow transcript, right? Where
Yeah.
you have a transcript besides your academic transcript that's not just about the courses you took, but the skills you learned and the competencies you have.
Competency-based models.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And universities can invest in helping their students do those. I don't know
Yeah.
that professors are the ones who know how to do that. I don't know that professors should, right? Like if a university, if my employer came to me and said, Corey, we need you to have an extra page on your syllabus with all the skills and competencies your students learn, first of all, I'd be very annoyed. And second of all, I'm not sure I'd be able to do that, right? But there are models where the university does that. I think Northeastern, I'm pretty sure, has a model
Yes.
where they have a whole office of folks who will take a faculty's member's syllabus and write some kind of statement. I'm not sure what the output looks like of the
Yeah.
skills the employable skills that students will learn if they take that class, right? And the faculty member doesn't have to change anything. The faculty member doesn't have to put it on their syllabus, but Northeastern does that translation work for their students, I believe. And I think that kind of model could be very successful.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, just to kind of close that question. I mean, Northeastern's been innovative in this way because they also have the kind of like learn and work kind of model where they have a lot of there's a lot of kind of emphasis on like work-based learning and stuff like that. So I mean, I think that's a good point to end on where like one thing that happens with the college, with how colleges translate to work is an act of transcripting, is an act of documentation, which might similarly help see the kind of the similarities, the broad
Yeah,
similarities between the
totally.
skills earned by your liberal arts and practical arts majors. And again, I'll thank you, Corey, for the responses to the questions. And I'm going to open it up to the audience at this point. Uh, Cameron, go ahead.
Hi there. Hi, Dr. Moss-Pech. It's a pleasure to meet you. My name's Cameron Rose Smith. I'm a second year PhD sociology student at UT Austin. Forgive me, I'm still in the process of reading your book. So if this question is kind of outside the bounds of what I've read thus far, I apologize. But I wanted to kind of talk to you about how, you've been working on this project since you were a graduate student. And my questions, I have two, but I'll start with one is, how did you decide or come to the determination as to what to publish ahead of time in like article format versus what to include in the book versus what of the data to include after the book? Like, how did you come to that determination?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I really appreciate that it's like a sort of practical, like how the sausage is made question that is so often like not included in conversations that we have with graduate students, right? So I really appreciate that. Um, so the sort of short answer is like the first article that I published from this project, which was about the internships, um, I published that article because like that's what I thought my dissertation was about. It turned out my dissertation was about something totally different, and I didn't really know until later, right? But it was basically like I started the data collection. I knew that it would be advantageous for me as someone who was aspiring to be an academic to publish an article from it before I was, on the market or while I was on the market. And so, the first thing that I looked at was internships because that was the thing that really motivated the study. And so I wrote this article about internships, and I thought my book is about internships, so that's, great that this is what the article is about. But like any good qualitative project, as I got into it, I sort of was pleasantly surprised to learn, like, actually, this is about something else. This is about how different degree fields have distinct labor market opportunities, and these are tied to the cultural prestige of these disciplines, right? Which is not what I had anticipated going in. And that was what it turns out the dissertation was about. And so then after I wrote the book, I wrote another article that made that argument a little bit more formally and academic, right? So the book is written to speak to undergraduate students, people working in higher education, right? A general educated audience. But I published a paper just this year in the Review of Higher Education that takes one of the main article or one of the main sort of empirical points of the book and turns it into a much more formal academic argument about the theories of the school to work transition, right? Which would have been too technical to include in the book. And then there were other interesting parts of my dissertation that originally were part of the book, but I took out because when you write a book, you have to kind of tell one story and you might stray too much from that story. So I published an article last year on technical control and entry-level white-collar work. And that article was originally part of the book, but it was part of the chapter on what graduates did in their entry-level jobs. But that part of the book, though I thought interesting, didn't really contribute to the one overall narrative of the book, right? And so I cut it from the book and I wrote it as a standalone article. So, books have to make one point, and they have to make one point in a book length form and be written in a way that appeal to a slightly wider audience and it's written in a different style, right? Journal articles are written very defensively, books are written a little bit more proactively. Um, so all of those things went into the considerations. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. If it's all right with the group, I have one more question. That's okay. Um, you know, and this is one thing that I'm finding in like my own qualitative research right now, looking at like college to career pathways, labor market outcomes, and like perceptions of like the whole process among undergraduates is like when you're bogged down in all these details about their experiences in education, in their internships experience, like how have you found or how has the process been of like tying it back to sociology? Because, depending upon the audience, this can just be about like labor market outcomes and internships, right? But like constantly thinking sociologically about something, did that ever like stray away from you? And did you have to like tether it back to Soch? And if so, how did you do that?
That's an interesting question. Dan, do you have thoughts about this?
No, go ahead. Go.
Um, I was just going to say, like, one of the things, maybe this will be helpful, maybe this won't be helpful, but I'm going to try. You know, I don't necessarily consider myself a sociologist of education or a sociologist of work, right? I mean, I am both of those things. But I really think of myself as like a stratification and mobility scholar. So I always came at this with the perspective of like, sometimes when I give talks about the book to like a largely undergraduate population, they want to know about my own experience, my own college major, these kinds of things. And one of the things that I say is I'm a person who experienced a tremendous amount of social mobility through higher education. And I believe that that's one of the few routes to true social mobility that still exists in the United States, right? And so the entire time I was working on the book and working on my dissertation and thinking about the data, I never strayed too far from the sociology of it all. I never came close to writing a sort of more practical or policy-oriented book that strayed too much from the sociology of it all. Because the thing that I really care about and the thing that I ultimately see as the point of the book is to tell a story about social stratification and social mobility, right? not a story about the sort of technical details of the college to work transition, right? And so for me, that was always front and center. Um, and I think there are lots of ways, even if you are a person who's a more technical scholar, to bring that back in, right? To be thinking about, you know, the theories that motivate you, to be thinking about the stratification and inequality outcomes, right? To be thinking about how this ties to a larger story, right? Like all great qualitative books tie their sort of micro data to a larger macro social story, right? And for me, it's about the cultural value of fields and the changing of the economy, right? Even though I don't really have data on those things, right? That is the sort of broader story. So I guess the way I would answer your question is twofold. Like one is like you have to tie it to a broader story. And that's not something that's going to happen easily or quickly, right? That is usually something that happens in the post dissertation, but writing the book phase, right? Because in the dissertation, you're so worried about, understanding your empirical data and understanding the literature that you're engaging with. So like the larger social story comes a little bit later, at least in my experience. Um, and by keeping the inequality and stratification implications front of mind, even as you're like in the weeds or the details of that data or the work or the article you're writing or anything like that.
I think that's a
Awesome.
great answer. And just as a
Thank
person who
you.
also does kind of like narrow technical work in higher education research, right, around developmental education and remediation and things like this and math education, when people ask me, so what's the sociological point? It is like Corey, it's about inequality, it's about stratification, it's about who gets assigned these more arduous paths through college versus who gets assigned less arduous paths, and whether or not that's valid or useful. And much like the kind of the devaluing of the liberal arts, it's the kind of like, it's a kind of a symbolic cultural arbitrary who gets assigned to remediation that has a lot more to do with your socioeconomic background than it does with your kind of academic achievement. And so keeping focused on that big sociological narrative is hard at times because you need to get into the details, right? Um, but uh, but we still need to do that. Like we have to get back into that at some point. And so
Yeah.
I agree with Corey's
And,
answer.
and the last thing I want to say about this to sort of Dan's point as well is like, you know, I've had lots of conversations with graduate students who aren't necessarily interested in like an academic career or an academic job. And if you're a sociologist, your sort of value add, even in a sort of academic adjacent or non-academic job, is your understanding of stratification and inequality, right? So even if it was that somebody like Dan who studies math remediation was going to get a job at a pure, research policy organization, the reason they would hire Dan as a sociologist when they instead of like an economist or a data analyst is because Dan is a sociologist, right? And so those parts of being a sociologist are really relevant, um, even if you're doing more technical work, I think.
I'll take another question, the one in chat from Miji Lee. Based on your research, Corey, what are the quote, I guess the hard truths that liberal arts students are not being told about entering the workforce?
Great question. I think it depends on where you go to school because one of the things that I really believe is that college majors are qualitatively different things depending on the institution in which you are majoring in it, right? So, like an English major at Princeton is different than an English major from Florida State, which is different from an English major at Tallahassee State College, right? Like, I think all of the sort of discourse kind of collapses a very complex higher education ecosystem into these like caricatures of degrees. And the reason why I think that's relevant for your question is because I think students' expectations vary widely depending on the institutional context, right? So the English majors that I interviewed, none of them wanted to write the next great American novel, right? Like none of them had that ambition. None of them wanted to move to Hollywood and write screenplays. Like that just wasn't the frame of reference for these students in the way it might be if you went to say NYU, right? These students wanted, in what chapter 2 of the book I call practical passions, like middle class jobs that just related to their degrees, right? And met several of them were able to achieve that. But I think the hard truths that a lot of college students don't really understand, especially liberal arts majors, is just how low many entry level salaries are, right? Like I think if you were to ask me like what is one thing that liberal arts majors don't know, um, that maybe they should, it's that even if they get the job they desire, and even if that job is really interesting to them, it is unlikely, but not impossible, that it will pay them a middle class wage, right? Um, and this is something that, I don't know that you could really get to sink in, right? If you had told me when I was 17 or 18 or whatever that I got, if I wanted to work in the field that I was studying, I would have to make very little money. I would be like, yeah, of course, that's okay. I just want to do something interesting to me. And if you were to ask me now, 20 years later, I would be like, well, I need a job that pays me well, right? But there are multiple ways students can handle this, right? I had one student who was a communications major who went and got a corporate job that she didn't really like, but paid pretty well because she had a lot of student loans and had to pay them off. And after a couple of years had paid them off and went and did a more interesting job that didn't pay her as well, right? I think we think more in terms of people doing the opposite, right? They enter a field that's interesting and then they don't make a lot of money and then they sort of like quote unquote sell out and go and do something else. But I think students could really benefit from learning that the opposite pathway is possible as well, right? Like you can get a corporate job that's not that interesting to you, that pays you pretty well to get you a little bit financially stable, and then you can go try something else. Um, so I think that's a potential answer. And then I guess well, no, I think I'll just leave it there. I think really understanding about the trade-off between interesting work and stable middle class employment is really important because very few graduates from my kind of school among my graduates had both of those things.
We'll take other questions over audio or on chat, however people like to provide questions.
So I can add a question. I just wanted to follow up, Corey, on your comments about AI. And I'm curious what you think would be advice for students in these different fields in terms of how they should use AI or begin to engage with it and think about how it could be useful for them in the workforce. Like, how should they be approaching and learning to use or not learning to use AI?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that there is a tendency, and maybe this is going to make me sound like an old person, but that's fine. Like, I think there's a tendency for students or employers to think that like, well, if you just plug something into AI, it'll do the thing, right? But that's not really how it works. You like as a professional sociologist, when I use AI, you know, I if it's about something sociological, I very quickly see and understand that it is flawed in many ways, right? And so I guess that's the kind of lesson, right? Is that for you to actually use AI competently in a field for your schoolwork or in a job that's related to your field, the best way you're going to be able to do that is by being an old-fashioned expert, right? Like to be able to actually understand how AI can help you, how AI comes up short, where the gaps are in what the AI is doing, and how to sort of fix any problems that you encounter with AI. You need to build a knowledge base, and the way that you build a knowledge base is actually not by using AI, right? And this is true, right? There's all this research that shows that if you use AI to complete some kind of task, you don't really learn the thing, right? So we could imagine that, to use a sort of basic example and the kind of thing that AI is probably usually going to get right, if you are trying to learn algebra and so you just have AI do your algebra homework, it will probably get the questions right, but you're not going to really learn algebra. And if you have to do something really complicated and the AI is a little bit wrong, you're not going to be able to figure it out, right? But if you've learned algebra the old-fashioned way and then have to sort of use and so for your job you choose to use AI to like help you do your algebra, you're going to be able to find when it's wrong. And I know that's like a very silly example because AI is probably never going to be wrong when it does algebra and you know nobody's job is like doing algebra. But I think the basic lesson is right. You know, if I try, and we see this as professors working with graduate students, if I say to AI, write me a lit review about the college to work transition, it is going to do a job where if I don't know anything about it, I will think it did a good job, right? But as a professor and expert in that field, I'm going to see immediately that it didn't do a good job. And so I think becoming an expert the old-fashioned way is actually the best way to be a responsible and effective user of AI. And I also think that AI, it's what is the right way to say this? It's like the way that AI is set up, right? It is sort of like predictive, right? And so if you are not an expert and it just shows you what the most likely answer is, often that will be the right answer, but often it won't be. And you have to be an expert to know that. Um, and so yeah, I'll just leave it at that, I think.
I think we have time for maybe one more question if somebody wants to jump in. Otherwise, I think I have a last question that I would ask. Oh, Cameron, jump in again.
Yeah, again, forgive me if you mentioned this in the part of your book I haven't gotten to yet, but how did you make sense of like your negative cases? Like if you're coming to like this whole, new argument of how we're like critiquing the way we, like avoiding the use of like human capital or rethinking human capital, extending it and making this large argument, but then you have these negative cases. Like how did you navigate that?
Yeah, so it's a good question. And another way you can think about it is like, what about the students who actually just had really good outcomes, right? Who had good jobs and used their skills? And there were some of them, right? But based on my analysis, there were not patterned differences, right? So, and there was no way to predict if a student was going to end up in that outcome. And I think that this is, again, like intuitive. Like you just have to think about it in terms of the systems, right? So if you're a big company like General Motors and you're hiring 100 entry-level engineers, like part of the reason why you're doing that is to find 10 or 15 really good engineers that you can really develop into some of the most senior and important roles in your organization, right? Like you're not going to find like it's an information problem, right? If you just hire 15, if you say we need 10 engineers to do really technical work, let's go find the 10 best engineers, you might not be able to do that, right? But if you can hire 100 and there are lots of other roles in the organization where it's beneficial to have engineers, then you can do that. Um, and so I don't think there was any real rhyme or reason, especially because, right, a lot of the graduates of these disciplines accept these jobs long before what they know they'll be doing and long before the organization has even assigned them to a role, because these are such large organizations and they're sort of assessing their needs and then putting the graduates into different positions. So I guess the answer to your question is to try to understand why they're anomalies because, right, oftentimes as the sort of cliche goes, it's the exceptions that prove the rule. If you can understand why the anomalous cases are anomalous cases and what they have in common with the other cases, you can distill some information. So I'll give you one more small example. There's a graduate who, when I talk about the book, I call her June. She's a communications graduate. She works for a giant manufacturing conglomerate, right? Like a Fortune 50 company that everybody's heard of. A lot of the engineering graduates in my sample also work at that organization.
Mhm.
But she makes $30,000 a year, and they often make $65,000 or $70,000 a year. And so she's a really good anomalous case because she shows you, even if you are the rare communications major who gets a stable job in a large organization with a fine-grained division of labor, much like the engineering and business majors get, she still gets paid way less than them. And it's because it's just cheaper to hire a communications major, right? So trying to really isolate like what is it about those cases and what you can say about those cases relative to the other ones to help sort of clarify or better understand what it is that you're going for.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'll just like that makes me think, and I don't know if this is a way to round it up, but it's like that corner case, that student like June kind of makes the cultural value argument at the end
Yeah,
of the day,
totally.
right? That it's like it's not about skills. It might be partially about social connections, right? But at the end of the day, this person kind of betrays all that, and what you see is just English majors, as you said, are skilled but not cheap, but are also cheap at the same time because there's maybe many more of them, and it comes down to a labor market question. Um, with that, thank you so much, Corey, for the talk, and I think we'll let it, unless you have any final words.
I just really appreciate it. Thank you all. Thank you for coming. It's just such an honor to be able to share my work, right? When you write a book, when you're a graduate student writing a dissertation and then a postdoc writing a book, you just assume nobody's going to read it, right?
Yeah,
So it's like really remarkable when that's not the case. And so I'm very grateful.
thanks. Michelle, do you want to round us up?
Yeah, so yeah, this has been a fantastic discussion. I just want to thank everybody for joining us today and for being part of this discussion. And hope you continue to follow our work at ERC and join us for future webinars and get on our mailing list. So thank you again for a really great discussion. Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Corey. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you all very much. I appreciate it.
See you, Corey.
Bye, Dan. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.